So I'm going to carry on the theme of the video we just saw and talk to you about trees and shrubs. And what I hope to do today is instill some confidence in you that you can grow your own trees and shrubs. You can propagate them yourselves easily. You can save a lot of money doing it by yourself, and you'll benefit yourself, your family, your community, and so forth. So my name is James Fargo. I live in Cache Valley, Utah. We don't. I'm not a full-time, not full-time in agriculture. We have a small-scale farm where we live, and we sell produce. We mostly do produce and annuals, but we do a lot of experimentation where we are, and we've been playing around with trees and shrubs a while, and I'm really convinced that trees and shrubs have a lot to offer us that we don't often contemplate. So with that, I'll get into it. And you can get this presentation on the website, and I hope you'll download it because I've embedded a lot of links into that presentation. And so you can get all this information. I'm going to go through some of the slides fairly quickly just because we don't have a lot of time. And then there's some other resources on the webpage that I've included with this talk. I think I'll just hold this because I need to look at the presentation. Okay. Oh, I want to start out with a little bit of a spiritual lens for a minute. So, in the beginning, God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed should be in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And so God provided grasses, plants, grains, or annuals, fruits, and nuts, which are perennials. And I, God, said unto man, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which shall be the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food. So predominantly for man, plants and grains, which are annuals, and then fruits, perennials, and nuts. And then he said, And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein I grant life, there shall be given every green herb for food. So predominantly for animals, green plants. And then the Lord said that he planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there I put the man whom I had formed. And out of the ground made I, the Lord God, to grow every tree naturally that is pleasant to the sight of man. And man could behold it. And it became also a living soul, speaking of the trees. For it was spiritual in the day that I created it, for it remains in the sphere in which I, God, created it, yea, even all things which I prepared for the use of man. And man saw that it was good for food. Trees are living souls, which were good for food, fruits and nuts. Notice that God is not pointing out annual grains or plants in his garden. They may have been there, but yet they have been prepared previously for the use of man. But when he's speaking of his garden, he's talking about trees. And I, the Lord God, took man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And I, the Lord God, commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it. So Adam was encouraged to partake of the food from every tree in the garden except for one. That was what they ate. But then we know what happened. They got cast out of the garden. The woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which you behold in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat of it, and neither shall you touch it, lest you die. When they were expelled from the garden, the Lord said, Cursed shall be the ground for your sake. In sorrow you shall eat of it, the ground, all the days of your life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat of the herb of the field. By the sweat of your face shall you eat bread until you shall return unto the ground, for you shall surely die. For out of it you were taken, for dust you were, and to dust you shall return. There's no mention of the trees anymore. the fruits and the nuts, or they're being good for man. God is pointing them to the ground as their predominant source of sustenance to come from annual plants. Man is now made similar to the animals, whose predominant source of sustenance was also annual plants. Instead of reaching up to the heavens and partaking of food growing abundantly on trees in the garden, man must now bow down to the earth and toil for their food from annual plants. So it's hard to say exactly how the trees and shrubs in our world today reflect what was once in Eden, whatever their diminished current form may be. And of course, fruits and nuts have continued to be a food source for people all over the world for millennia. However, food from perennials is not the primary, food source for any modern culture today. There's some indigenous cultures that we, in times past, that we often condescendingly refer to as hunter-gatherer. We think we're so much smarter because we can use an iPhone or look something up on YouTube and learn about it. They had quite advanced knowledge. Diets of the more long-lasting cultures that have been on this earth primarily consisted of food from perennial trees and shrubs. They realized that tilling the soil provided nice short-term gains, but over time eventually depleted the soils far enough that it was unusable. I'm going to talk about a few books later, but there's one I want to point out right now. This book called Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture by J. Russell Smith. This was written in the 1950s. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and toured the world in a time when the world felt a little smaller. And he visited cultures around the world and discovered that those that relied on more perennial agriculture were more successful, more resilient, and long-lasting. And he went around and documented different crops from trees that are just as good as what we get from annuals in many places. The honey locust, for one, which is kind of a trash tree that you probably have one in your yard. They create those brown seed pods that are long and thin, and I used to throw them at my brother when we were younger, like swords, or darts. Turns out that those have more sugar content in them than, say, a pine, a sugar maple. And the USDA was conducting experiments in the 1930s with honey locust trees, very drought tolerant, very resilient to all kinds of climates. And you can take the seed pods, you can throw them in a chipper, and it makes animal food that they love. That they'll produce milk because it has such a high protein and sugar. It's a legume. It has a lot of sugar and protein content in it. So the USDA created these huge experimental farms in the South to look at honey locust, and they were very successful. But then suddenly they cut them all down and replaced them with peach trees. People were worried that they would replace standard stock feed for animals. This fellow in this book writes about the chestnut tree, calls it the corn tree as a replacement for corn. Also the oak tree. Walnuts, the meat and butter tree. The eastern black walnut, another meat and butter tree. Sorry, there's a bit of an echo, so sometimes I mess up what I'm saying here. Pecan tree, the king of hickories. Mulberry trees. He goes on, talks about all these different kinds of trees that we can use to live from. Anyway, and through this talk, I'm not advocating for a perennial-only kind of farm. We do a lot of annuals, and we sell them, and they're great. So how did your garden fare this year? The Bowdens and the others there, that looks like things went really well. It was a difficult year for a lot of people. The heat was extraordinary this year. There's a lot of water restrictions that were happening in different municipalities. How many people here had a water restriction of some sort in their municipality? Yeah, quite a few. There'll be more of that. There's only going to be more. And that's not really a total solution to the problem. There's lots of tangents we can take from here, but there's a lot of water in the state. A lot of it gets used for hay production. 2/3 of the water in the state gets used for hay production, and that's fine. Where I have a trouble is when a lot of that hay I see on semi-trucks going to the ports and being sent overseas, when I have farmers in Cache Valley that can't afford the hay for their animals anymore, and you have multi-generation dairies that are shutting down and selling their herds. There's a lot of water in the state, and the solution isn't to put a cap on you. It's to encourage you to grow things that can grow in this environment and create a new environment here. The country of Israel has continually decreased their average temperature by planting thousands and millions of trees over time. We would go a lot farther, giving every citizen $100 worth of shrub and tree seeds and pots and the materials to grow them and how to plant them in their yards than putting water restrictions on everybody. Anyway, what if you had to feed your family on what you grew in your garden? Could you do it? Well, what about even 50% of what you needed? Or 20%? How much time would it take you? Bowden's, how much time did it take you to do your little garden? Every day. Yeah, you have to be out there every day working on it. What resources would it take you to do it? What if your crop failed for the year? What would you do? I don't have answers, just questions. So here's some advantages of perennials, perennial trees and shrubs. I'm not talking about perennial vegetables here. Once they're established, less labor, more drought resistant, more cold resistant, more disease resistant, more pest resistant. You can use their material that they produce for mulch. You can propagate them with multiple techniques, and they can be transported. You can dig them up and move them around. They have some disadvantages. They take a long time to get, producing food. They have some early water needs at the beginning. Propagation is not difficult, but it's not always successful. And there's that long wait time to get a yield, especially if you're using sexual reproduction to create your crop, your plants. If they're not true to type, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, your apple may not be the same as the apple that the tree, the seed came from, the tree. Perennials can take up a lot of space and shade other things, and it takes some thought and planning things out. The benefits of trees and shrubs, the 4 Fs: food, fuel, fiber, and pharmaceuticals, medicine. Of course, wood is great for making things, and they're beautiful. They give shade. They hold water, like we saw in the video prior to this. Again, transpiration, cooling the climate, and of course, tree swings. Here's some perennial fruits and nuts that are great to grow. A lot of those will grow in this climate. So if you're thinking about getting started in doing more trees and shrubs, which I hope to encourage you to do, work with your location. I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics here because it's going to totally depend on your context. If you're down in Arizona versus up in Idaho or something, think about your soil type, cold, heat, rainfall, water access. Trees can grow in rocks. You see them on mountainsides. The soil requirements aren't extreme, but they'll grow slower. They might grow smaller as compared to more of a rich soil. You don't need to just do native only. You can, and that's fine. There's just not always going to be the variety that grow natively in your area. The benefit of native only is that the insects are kind of programmed to work with those those trees to pollinate them and so forth. But you should go to the USDA hardiness zone map and find what your zone is, and then go up a level or two. That's a good way to start to sort of figure out what will work in your area. And then plant or start way more plants that you intend to keep. As genetic variation will allow some plants to survive better in your condition than others. And so you'll get some that will have a disease or be more prone to something or whatever, maybe not as drought or cold tolerant, and you'll want to just get rid of those and keep a smaller subset. So, if you want to end up with 10, I'd start with like 100 seeds. It's not that expensive to get a few more seeds. And then in a lot of counties or areas, there are planting guides that you can look at that talk about what are the native trees to kind of give you a start. But again, you're not restricted to that. So I want to talk for a few minutes about plant propagation. William Blake said, by planting a seed, rooting a cutting, attaching a graft, you hold infinity in the palm of your hand. It's really pretty amazing what you can do with a little time and effort to grow plants, and you can create new varieties. You're not stuck with what they're selling you at the stores. Those are tried and true varieties, but you can create your own varieties that have adapted to your own locations. So there's kind of two classes of propagation, sexual and asexual. So sexual is growing a new plant from a seed. A completely new organism is created for the first time. This is like you having a child. The child is not exactly like either parent. The child is not exactly like a sibling. So most annuals, perennials in nature, and some perennials are propagated this way by humans, like if you're trying to breed a specific variety from seed. Or asexual or vegetative propagation is what you get from nurseries. So plant cells are programmed to create a duplicate plant, material used from parent plant to make a copy. So you could have a grape plant from thousands of years ago that may still be alive today because you've continually taken a cutting of that plant and propagated it. It has the same genetic material. You've made a clone. We're going to talk about division, layering, cuttings, and grafting. Oh yeah, some plants can be propagated using any method, some only one, some are better. Some methods are better with certain plants. Here's some basic materials you might need. Take really good notes so you remember what you're doing and remember what worked, especially if you're going to start doing 2 or 3 or 4 different varieties so you can keep track of where you got the seed from, when you did the propagation, when you transplanted it, etc. So growing from seed is a fun experiment. It allows the genetic diversity to start to come out, which again may be beneficial to create a new variety that adapts to your environment, is more cold hardy, more drought tolerant, disease tolerant, etc. Many annuals have sort of standardized themselves over time so that they're very similar, like grasses. It's not like you see a lot of variety when you plant a bunch of grass seed. They're very similar. Lots of things like that in the annual realm are fairly standardized, like vegetables and so forth. But many people don't plant tree and shrub perennial seeds because they're told that they don't come up true to type, and that may or may not be true. Some perennials are true to type from the seed. So like if you picked an apple from a Macintosh and then ate it and then planted the apple core somewhere, what you're going to get is probably not going to be a Macintosh. Maybe one in a million or 10,000 or something. It would, but it might be close, but it may not be. But there are some apple varieties that you can plant the seed and it is true to type. So those do exist. Let's see. So just some tips there on coming up with new varieties that work. Plant seeds near similar kinds of trees or shrubs that are doing well to try and get that cross-pollination going and create a new, exciting variety. So obtain seeds in the fall, starting now, as they start to dry out and fall from the trees and shrubs. Let them dry down and then store them. You can get them from free. You can collect them from neighbors. You can go on a hike and get them. I gather them when I travel. I see an interesting tree if I'm in the right place at the right time, and I'll take some of the seeds with me and try them out at home. You can trade with friends. You should start thinking about how, these seeds and gather them. And I've been in some places where I'm like, look like an idiot, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, look at all these seeds, and I'm like gathering them all up. But you can I can't believe they're just letting all these seeds fall on the ground, but you can get some really good seeds. You can buy them online. Most places sell out of the good seeds for trees and shrubs, so get them now. I just got a catalog I'll have at my booth from a place that has really good tree and shrub seeds, and best selection is always early. If you go to a physical store to buy seeds, that could be fine, but just keep in mind that the longer seeds are out in a warmer area and not kept cool and dry, they'll be less, they'll have less germination potential. And then don't waste your time on foreign websites like in Canada. They won't ship seeds to the U.S., and you won't realize that on a lot of the websites until you get to the checkout, and you spent 4 hours on their website, like finding the right seeds for you, and then it says, oh, we can't ship to the U.S. So just make sure you know that. These are some of the places I like to buy tree and shrub seeds from. Etsy has actually a lot of really good people that are selling stuff, but be selective. You don't always know how they've been stored, and there are some scammers out there. There's a couple websites where I've lost some money on before, and there's others that are a bit of a scam. So planting them, if you're ready to go and you've got some pots outside or some ground, just plant them in the fall and let nature take its course. Make sure it's in an area where there'll be some sunlight and you'll get some rain and snow. And if they're well suited to the area, you'll see them come up in the springtime. If you're going to plant them inside or wait till the spring, you're going to have to mimic nature yourself. And depending on what the parent plant is, they'll need to go through a process of stratification and or scarification. So again, it's mimicking nature. We're putting the seed through a state where it will go dormant, and then it will come out of dormancy, and it will be softened. And I've got it's like 30 pages long, a document on the website that has the stratification and scarification procedures for lots of different tree and shrub varieties. When you're ready to plant them out, after they've gone through that cold, dormant phase, there's lots of ways to do it. You have to kind of think through how big the root is going to be and how long you want to stash them in a cell tray or a mini pot or something like that until you can get them out into the ground or move them or whatever. So there's lots of different ways to do that. Those in the middle there are, does this have a Those are called tree pots. These are called containers. It's a really nice little system for growing trees, and these are like a foot long, and then these are just your regular gallon pots. But lots of different ways to do it. I'm going to talk about air-prune beds in a minute. If indoors, you're going to need some grow lights and regular watering, of course. And then outdoors, make sure it's protected from animals. What's going to happen if you plant a bunch of chestnut nuts an inch or two below the ground? They're all going to be gone, right? They're not going to be there very long. These are some things from our yard. These are just apple trees that we planted, just in a regular grow bed. And then these are walnuts, a bunch of walnut trees. There's probably about 100 of them in this box, which are these kind of boxes, just made from some extra wood. This is probably overkill, but I just made these cages to go around these boxes, and it's to keep out the squirrels that we have, and raccoons or even cats, of course, because cats love to get into a nice soil and kind of dig it up and do their thing in there. So I don't want them digging up all my seeds. So we put these cages around them and then lock them down. And on the bottom of these, they're on pallets, but underneath each box is stapled a piece of hardware cloth, which is just like a mesh metal, in the big rolls. And that's so the roots come down and then they're air pruned out, so they're sort of stopped there. The taproot is stopped there, and then the other lateral roots will come out, and then they're transplanted from here in the fall after they hit their dormancy period. But in this little space here, there are maybe 2,000 trees, and this is a teeny area. I mean, those are just 4x4 pallets. So in a 12x4 area, we've got thousands of trees growing in there. We'll sell them or give them away or move them along in some way, but most of it again is just experimental. Sorry that's so dark. These you can see down in the bottom here. These are trees and tree pots. These are different nut trees, some chestnuts and hazelnuts and things. And we've got some containers over here with some different apple trees and so forth. And then in the smaller pots, I like to put the shrubs in there. These are like 4x4.5 or 5.5 inch pots. Let's see. I'm going to skip that. So plant division, we're moving on from seeds now to just dividing plants. Again, yeah, you can go to the store and spend $40 on a 3-gallon pot with a nice shrub in it. Maybe you've got a neighbor that has something that can be divided, and you can just go over there with your shovel and break it in half and put it in a pot, and of course with their permission take it home. So you can of course dig up suckers that you see coming off of a tree or a shrub and use those to transplant, and then you can also just divide other things more in the winter time or early spring. Plant layering is a really interesting and easy technique that you can do with most perennial trees and shrubs. It may take longer with trees, but it still works. So what you do here is you take some part of the tree, usually a branch, and you put it into contact with a soil medium, and you kind of bury it. And over time, that part of the tree or shrub will grow roots of its own, and then you can sever that, and you have a new plant, right? So this often happens in nature by itself. You've maybe had like a blackberry or something like that, and it has this really long branch, and it hits the ground, and then you're out there pruning or something, and you're like, oh, this is stuck to the ground, and then you pull it up, and it's got its own roots. So trees and shrubs are kind of programmed to grow like that. So start the layering process in the springtime, just right before they kind of start to come out of dormancy and the sap starts to flow. Here's just simple, or what's known as branch layering, where you take a low-lying branch buried in the ground and maybe tack it in there with an anchor of some kind and then stake it. And here's some instructions on how to do that. There's tip, mound, and stool layering. Again, where you just tuck a branch in more by the tip instead of in the middle of the branch. And mound layering is really great for a lot of smaller shrubs, maybe like a currant bush, a gooseberry, or a yastaberry bush, or something like that you want to divide. This is a great method if you have a tree that you want to propagate. It'll take probably 2 years at least, though. But you just bury the whole tree underground, and eventually new shoots will start to come up, and you can just cut those, and you've turned one tree into many. This you may have seen this in your own experience, like if you cut down a tree, and even if you rip it out, you may not get all of the root, so the root will start to put up new shoots, and you've got a new tree there. Plant cuttings is another way where you cut off a part of a plant, a branch or a stem, and you're cloning it, you're putting it in a medium, it will start to grow. And this can be very easy to do for lots of different tree and shrub varieties. Different kinds of cuttings there depending on what you're working with. Some tips on how to go about it. Some can be difficult. I've tried cuttings from different fruit trees, and they're very slow to develop roots. They will, but they're very slow, and you have to have this nice balance of keeping them moist, but also giving them enough airflow and not too moist. I found it hard to do hardwood cuttings in terms of root development in our climate. It's not impossible, but it takes everyday care and attention, which I don't often have. I want to talk about rooting hormones for a minute. Most plants release auxins, which is like a growth hormone that helps the roots form naturally. And rooting hormones excuse me. Rooting hormones are applied to the exposed plant tissue to help stimulate root growth. There are natural and synthetic rooting hormones available. Synthetic can be toxic to humans, so just use them with care. And they come in a liquid or powder form. Here's some natural rooting hormone methods. Some of them have research backing, like apple cider vinegar, aloe vera gel, fresh coconut milk, or vermicompost, which is like worm casting compost, brewed and then applied. And then there's other common methods that people use, and I've seen these used to success, but they don't have the research backing, like willow tea, where you're taking willow branches and chopping them up and then brewing those for a bit. Saliva. There's some farm wisdom that suggests that saliva of ruminants like cows stimulates regrowth of plants in the pasture. And aspirin is another one. And then these aren't really rooting hormones, but they've been found to be beneficial. One thing that often happens when you're trying to root something is that it'll get infected by some disease. So these can help get rid of bacteria and disease, unpasteurized honey, a cinnamon mixture, and hydrogen peroxide. Grafting trees is a really good thing to learn how to do. You can not only to easily propagate new trees, but maybe to save a tree that you've had that has sustained severe damage or the top has started to die off, but the roots are still good. I mean, this is all over the scriptures, about grafting. This is an ancient practice that's been around forever. You don't need to be some kind of plant geneticist or botanist to do grafting. It's very easy to do. So you just need to make sure that the parts of the trees that you're grafting together are compatible with each other. You can graft trees at any age. They should at least be into their second year. There's lots of different forms of grafting, and it's really fun to go online, especially onto YouTube, and see some interesting ways that people have grafted trees together. You can graft, of course, several varieties of say a peach tree onto one peach tree, and you'll have branches that will have different, peach fruits growing on them. And so the most basic grafting technique is to graft a small tree branch to a root trunk. So you get like a first-year growth from a branch, and you get some kind of a root known as a root stock. And that's usually like a second-year tree, maybe a third-year tree, very small. And then you take this scion wood, which is the branch, and you do some kind of a graft, depending on the size, matching of the two. Put them together, wrap them, put some kind of a wax on them, and voila, here's some from our place. These are mostly apple trees of different varieties. You can see the junction about right there, the little black. Those are all, those are maybe like 3 or 4 months. 3 months after grafting, and we started with a graft right there, and the cyanwood, the branch that we connect was like, it's just like 2 or 3 buds, so it's like 4 inches long. Here's some that we did to our existing fruit trees. I like to use these metal tags. They're a little bit more expensive, but they last as long as they don't get lost, and you can engrave on them. But it's a little hard to see. It's a bit dark, but there's a graft right there. It's growing out. Here's 2 grafts. There's one down here, and then there's another one. I think it's right there. These were some just suckers that came up from an apple tree that we removed, and I just grafted other, better apple trees onto those suckers that came out of the ground, some cider apples and things. Here's a natural grafting occurring where these pine trees were really close together, and this branch just like, boom, went right into this other one. But look at how much bigger this tree on the right is above that. So it's sort of like infusing its life force into that other tree. It was pretty cool. Anyway, a lot of different grafting techniques out there. Again, you may have a tree that's like damaged from a storm, or you just don't like the fruit of it. Don't just totally rip it out. Like, get some cyanwood and graft it on and just turn it into a new tree. There's some tips on cyanwood. That's usually gathered like in January or February while it's cold, and then you'll just want to store them in the refrigerator until sap starts flowing in the trees. They're ready to be grafted at that time. Here's some resources on places where I've found are good places to get cyanwood and rootstock, and then some recommended that I've liked for different common fruit trees. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of, this isn't really tree propagation, but again, it's something to think about. Coppicing is a technique that's been around for thousands of years. It really hasn't been around too much in the U.S., but this is basically treating trees as like a crop where you're harvesting firewood and small wood for projects. So what you're doing is you're either cutting the tree down to the ground, and you've probably all seen this where I'm going to cut that tree down, and then like the next season it's kind of grown back and it looks like this crazy bush. That's your coppicing is what that is. And so that can be done methodically with certain hardwood trees and other deciduous trees to grow the kind of wood that you want to have, maybe for small projects or fences or something like that. There's a related technique called pollarding. It's really the same thing. It's like that picture on the right there. You're just cutting the tree higher so that animals can't reach and eat. They love to eat those little tender shoots that come out. So that would help protect them. We do tap some of our trees, and so we were asked explicitly to include this in the presentation. We have Norway maples on our property, and we've tapped them for years. But you can tap, in theory, you can tap any deciduous tree because they all generate sap. They're not all going to taste like a yummy maple syrup, but some of them have different unique flavors, like a butterscotch or a spicy flavor. There's many cultures around the world that rely on sap for health benefits. They'll drink like gallons of sap from certain trees and then go into like a sweat lodge and sweat it out, and then the nutrients are kind of concentrated in their bodies. But of course, maple trees, birch trees are also a great one. Alders, nut trees. You can tap nut trees for a sap. Linden trees, ironwood, Asian sugar plum. It's more of a tropical tree. And then there's some others. But don't tap a black locust, smoke tree, staghorn sumac, or buckthorn. It'd be toxic. How to tap them. The sap needs to be flowing, so the best time to do that when it's below freezing at night, and then in the 30s or low 40s during the day. The tree should be at least a foot in diameter for one tap. If it's bigger than 20 inches, you could do 2. And I just give some instructions on how we do it. Let's see if there's, you'll have to get the equipment. It's not very expensive, But make sure you get lids if you do this, because otherwise you'll get like I mean, it's not a big deal, but you'll have a lot of contaminants in there, like bugs and sticks and dirt and stuff will get in there. And it will snow in there and rain in there and dilute things even further. And then here's how we process it. You can also, of course, mix sap across trees and come up with your own recipes. So you have to boil it down, of course. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. If you're using like a wood stove method, we have a water distiller that we don't use very much. So we've actually sort of dedicated our water distiller to be our sap distiller. And so we'll put a gallon of sap in there and we'll run it for almost its full time. We don't want it all the way boiled down. We want a little bit left, so we kind of know where that is. We'll take it out of there and we'll just burn the rest off on the stove in a pan. And for a gallon, we get about a half cup of sap. You know, it doesn't seem like very much, but you know that's how it goes with sap. It's usually like a 40-to-1 or a 60-to-1 or higher ratio. Of course, sap can be used for lots of other things. Wanted to give you a few resources. This book over here on the right, Secrets of Plant Propagation by Lewis Hill. Got a copy here if you want to stop by my booth later and check it out. It's not a very big book. It's fantastic. Highly recommend that. Mentioned the tree crop book. Mark Shepard's Restoration Agriculture is probably one of the most influential books in modern farming in the last decade. It's fantastic. I love this book, Trees of Power, written by Akiva Silver. He's just an enlightened individual who has spent his whole life with trees and really has a good sense of how to grow and cultivate trees for use by people. A few others that I think are really excellent, Cold Hardy Fruits and Nuts, Edible Forest Garden, this 2-volume set is fantastic. The price has really come down lately, so I think you can get those both for around $100 now. And these are excellent, a few others here. And then, you know, just to conclude, you know, it should be obvious to anybody here that the world is really in a time of upheaval. And what we're seeing is what the beginning of a new civilization looks like. All of our systems are failing and suffering. People don't know what to do. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow, Carl Jung once said. It's time to get prepared. It's time to stop sitting around and thinking about what you're going to do. It's time to do something. You can work with your friends and your neighbors, maybe your fellowships or whatever, and share plant material and work together to come up with different plant varieties that work for you. Your goal should be to feed yourself and feed your family and feed your community. We need to relearn how to become more integrated with nature and work with it. And if you're interested in discussing these things further, come by my table. I just wanted to say, as it was in the beginning, we started with that from the book of Genesis, so it will be in the end. Learn how to work with trees. Learn how to use them to benefit each other. They can really be a valuable food source and something important in our lives. So thank you very much. Hope it was beneficial.